Welcome to the Civic Hub. The Civic Hub is a shared community space for grassroots and small nonprofit organizations working to make lives better for everyone in Waterloo region. Partner organizations come from a range of fields: environmental justice, democratic reform, arts and culture, anti-poverty, anti-racism, human rights, ethno-cultural and newcomer support, technology, peace and nonviolence, spirituality, and well-being. On the show, we welcome one of our partners to the Civic Hub. Today on Welcome to the Civic Hub, we have Dave Arthur from the Fair Vote Waterloo Region Chapter. David, welcome to the Civic Hub.
Thank you.
Suppose we better start off with the beginning. Fair vote. Sounds like there's some idea that voting might not be fair overall. What does Fair Vote Waterloo do?
Well, fair vote means that the voting process is fair to all voters, or all Canadians, in other words. And our premise basically is that the way it is now, it's not really fair, because if people in a local riding do not vote for the person who won that riding, then they don't have any representation in Parliament. That's what it amounts to, and so that's basically why it's not considered to be a really democratic way of electing people.
So really, unless you vote for the winner,
that's right.
You really might as well not have voted at all.
That's exactly right. And unfortunately, that's the attitude that a lot of people take. People who are voting for a party that they know is not going to win will just basically stay home and watch TV or something. Mm-hmm. And that shows up in the voting turnouts. Looking at this, I think here, voter turnout and by country, and the voter turnouts are way up in the 80s and the high 70s and so on for countries that use proportional representation. And then countries that use first past the post, like us, are way down at the bottom, where their voter turnout is much, much less. And that's basically the reason. People will say, well, why should I vote? My vote doesn't really count.
Yeah. Even worse, there's something called strategic voting as well.
That is another outcome of our first past the post system, is that people will say, well, okay, the party I really want to vote for doesn't have a chance in my riding. So, looking at the other parties, do I really want the party that seems to be doing the best to win, or should I vote for one of the other parties in order to increase their chances of beating that other party? Strategic voting. And unfortunately, that is a common feature of our electoral system in Canada.
So you end up voting for a candidate that you don't really want, only to not give extra votes to a candidate that you want even less.
That's right.
Yeah, so it's voting by denial rather than voting by what you really want.
That's right, exactly. And unfortunately, that shows up in our voter turnouts. The voter turnout, we have a chart here showing voter turnout by country, and the countries that have the highest voter turnout use proportional representation. They do not use first past the post like our country or the United States or some other countries do, and that's one of the reasons why. People say, well, why should I bother? I'll stay home and watch TV.
So what's the difference between proportional representation and first past the post?
So in first past the post, each riding has its own election, and they have candidates, typically one from each party, on the ballot, and the people vote, and the candidate that gets the most votes wins that riding. And every riding basically works that way. However, in proportional proportional representation, what the countries do is they use a system where every vote counts towards representation in Parliament, and even if they didn't vote for the winning candidate in their riding, their vote still counts in the overall to determine the people who win seats in the government across the country. And there are different ways of doing that, many different ways. And basically, the most common, of course, is proportional representation, where if a candidate gets 40% of the votes, if a party gets 40% of the votes, then they get 40% of the seats in Parliament. Mm-hmm. Whereas in our system, which is called first past the post, and that comes from, of course, horse races, because the first horse that passes the post wins the race. And in our system, what happens is the candidate that gets the most votes in each riding wins that seat in Parliament. And what that does is it leads to all kinds of distortions in the number of seats that each party gets in Parliament. So a party might actually get 40% of the votes, but they might actually get 60% of the seats in Parliament because of the way each riding turned out.
In order for that to work, you said that if my first choice doesn't get in, my second choice does. That's not the way our ballots work either. Our ballots would have to be different.
That's right, exactly. And there are different ways of doing this, so that if a party gets, say, 40% of the votes, then they get 40% of the seats in Parliament. Mm-hmm. There are different ways of doing it, and different countries around the world find ways of doing that. There are various ways of accomplishing that, but basically it's still called proportional representation. So if a party gets 40% of the votes, they get 40% of the seats in Parliament. How that is accomplished, of course, depends on the country. They have there are different ways of achieving that, and but essentially it works the way their election works.
Yeah. So in our voting system, where we put one single check mark beside one candidate's name on the ballot, to get those second choices to count, you'd have to have a ranked ballot of some sort.
Yes.
Putting your favorite candidate as number one and the second one as number two, and the ones you like least, you might leave those off altogether.
That's right. That's right. And there are different ways of doing it. Different countries use different systems. In a lot of the countries of the world, which I show in a chart up here, most OECD countries and European countries and most countries in the world use a system which uses a party list, where each party puts out a list of candidates, and then the voters basically select that particular party, and if it's an open list, then they can actually rank the candidates from that party, and then the candidate from that party that gets the most votes wins that particular seat. So it can be done in different ways, and a lot of it depends on the size of the country. Smaller countries tend to use what are called party lists, where each party puts out a list of their candidates, and then the election happens, mm-hmm. and then if a party got 40% of the votes, then they're going to get 40% of the seats in Parliament, right. and that comes off of the list of candidates that the party provided. That's one way of doing it, but there are other ways as well.
The biggest difference there is the way that the ballots are actually counted and the way that the votes are allocated to the different candidates and the different parties.
That's right. And in some countries they use what are called closed lists, where the party puts their candidates in order of how they will win or not mm-hmm. win. Or it could be an open list where voters can actually rank the candidates, and they look at the whole list and they say, well, here's the candidate that I think should be the first choice, second choice, third choice, and they go by that. So different countries do it different ways, and they try to reflect the size of the country, the number of voters, what will be considered to be fair. The overall principle of the whole thing of proportional representation is fairness. So if a party gets 40% of the votes, they get 40% of the seats in Parliament. If they get 20% of the votes, they get 20% of the seats in Parliament. And of course, that doesn't happen in countries that use our system, which is called first past the post, which comes from horse races. The horse that passed the post first wins, the other horses are out.
So really, it doesn't really make too much difference what particular counting method a country uses, what particular means of proportional representation, as long as the outcome is proportional. That's really the goal that you're trying to achieve here.
That's the goal, and there are different ways of achieving it, and a lot of that has to do with the way that the country sees their own electorate and the places. Smaller countries tend to use party lists, where each party puts out a list of the candidates, excuse me, and then once the votes are in, the top candidates win, or the choice of the voters, determines which one wins. There are other ways of accomplishing the same thing, and larger countries like Canada that are spread out from sea to sea to sea, have found other ways of doing it. Where, for example, in Canada, the system that was recommended by the Citizens Committee was called mixed member proportional. So there were, we have 338 ridings, and the idea was, okay, let's just have 220 ridings. They'll all be bigger than they are now by a little bit, by about a third. And then the other 118 seats will be determined by the number of votes that the party got. Now, where do those candidates come from? Well, could be different ways. It could be the candidates that came second in various ridings, or some other way. But usually Germany and Canada's recommendation for that was excuse me, was to use this what's called mixed member proportional, where about 2/3 of the seats are elected the same way they are now, and the other third are basically elected on the basis of the party votes.
So not perfectly proportional, but better than what we have today.
Yeah, and typically the mixed member proportional would turn out to be proportional just about every time.
Really?
Yep.
Okay, that's pretty good. So what's the outcome of what you've got today? I mean, we have members in Parliament. We have a minority Parliament at the moment. That's not so common under first past the post, is it? Normally, we get a majority Parliament with one party having more than 50% of the seats, even if they only get 40% of the votes. So what's the result of that? What happens when you've got a party in government with a majority of the seats? How's that bad for democracy?
Well, basically because it represents a minority of the voters, and so should the party that has a majority of the seats in Parliament, should they have 100% say or control over the outcome of things in Parliament when only 40% of the voters voted for them? And that's the biggest problem. It leads to all kinds of distortions in the results, and there are loads of examples historically. For example, only about a third of all of the elections since World War I in Canada, only about a third of the majority governments were true majority governments that got more than 50% of the votes. The rest of the majority governments were actually elected by a minority of the voters, not a majority. Now, is that fair? What does that mean for what does that mean for the 60% of the voters that did not vote for that party? They have basically no good representation in Parliament.
You see that provincially right now. Where in the provincial legislature, we have a majority held by the Progressive Conservatives,
Yep.
even though they only got about 40% of the votes.
That's right.
And so the other parties are pretty much, just appendages which can't actually sway the outcome. If the Progressive Conservatives vote for something because they've got the majority, whatever they say goes. They've got 100% of the power.
That's right, exactly. Now, the thing is, looking at a chart here, the number of countries that use first past the post around the world is a minority. Mm-hmm. The majority of countries around the world, OECD countries in Europe and so on and so forth, use proportional systems, where if a party gets 40% of the votes, they get 40% of the seats, not 60% of the seats.
In the OECD, it's really only Canada, Australia, and the UK, and the United States, of course, that don't use proportional representation for their elections.
Right. Yep.
Yeah, that's a significant minority, but
Yep.
trying to emulate places like Sweden, Denmark, Netherlands.
That's right.
Which do a much better job of electing representative governments.
That's right. And there are many other outcomes of all of this. When you look at voter turnout by country, voter turnout in countries that have proportional representation is consistently higher. So countries like Sweden, Denmark, the Netherlands, Austria, and so on typically have 80 to 90% of voters turn out to vote. Countries that use our system, first past the post, typically have maybe 60% of people turn out to vote or less. Yeah. People basically say, well, what the heck, my party's not going to win, so I'll stay home and watch TV. And that the evidence is there. The countries that have proportional representation have much higher voter turnouts. Yeah. And there's lots of reasons for that. They know their vote counts, even if the candidate that they voted for in their particular riding, even if that candidate doesn't happen to win their riding, their vote still counts towards the overall representation in Parliament. And there are different ways of doing it, and different countries have looked at different ways of accomplishing that. Some of it depends on the size of the country. In a small country, of course, where you don't have a lot of individual ridings, it makes some sense to use party lists of candidates for each party. Mm-hmm. For larger countries like Canada, it's helpful to look at a different way of doing it, so that you recognize different parts of the country having different, because we know that some parts of Canada tend to vote Conservative more than other parts of Canada. So, in the end, they would probably get more Conservative members of Parliament, and because of that. However, the overall representation in Parliament would still be proportional to the number of votes that party got.
A country like Canada, where you've got different issues, political issues on the East Coast, on the West Coast, and the Northern Territories, you want to have different makeups of the legislatures in those areas.
That's right.
Proportional representation will achieve that.
That's right.
Yeah. The other thing that proportional representation achieves is not just political fairness, but you get representation across gender lines. There's a lot more women who get elected into parliaments that have proportional representation.
That's right.
And the same is true for minorities, gender diversity. Yep. All those things become far more representative under a proportional representation system.
That's right. Now, I will say that in the past couple of decades, that has been improving somewhat, so that the proportion of male to female people in Parliament who win seats in Parliament has got better, closer to being the same. However, it's still not equal.
Yeah. So what's Fair Vote Waterloo doing to make this happen?
Well, Fair Vote Waterloo is, of course, one of the chapters of Fair Vote Canada, which is a national organization that has now been around for about 25 years. Mm-hmm. And it was established in order to promote the idea of proportional representation. That is their basic tenet, is proportional representation, and they have made the absolute claim that they are non-partisan. So they do not support any particular party. They support the whole idea that the people who get elected represent the proportion of the population that voted for that party. And that's what Fair Vote Canada represents.
Yeah. And so you've been going out to the various community organizations to deliver lectures. I was very much involved with Fair Vote Waterloo a few years back, and you and I, Dave, have been to some schools to do presentations to students for their civics class.
Yep.
That's one way of getting out there to spread that word.
That's right. And it's interesting that by doing that, you and I have done that. I've been to a number of schools and to other organizations like Probus and other groups to give presentations about the whole question around electoral systems and proportional representation. And it's interesting that one of the outcomes of that is when you give that presentation and you explain how proportional works and the advantages of it, which are many, by the way, typically the audience and the students that you're talking to get it. They say, well, how come it isn't that way? It seems kind of obvious that Parliament should represent all of the population, not just the members of a particular party as a result. So that's one of the things that happens with this. And as we know, and this is an important question here too, the whole idea of changing our electoral system has come up several times in British Columbia, in Ontario, and in Prince Edward Island. And in each case, what they did was they looked at the evidence. They had a committee, a citizens committee, look at all the evidence and then make a recommendation. And typically what has happened is the committee will recommend using a proportional system. But then what they do is they put out a referendum, usually tied to an election, to see if the public will support that. And strangely enough, in British Columbia, the public supported it with 58% of the votes. However, the government had established the fact that in order for it to pass through, it had to get 60% of the votes yes. And, you would wonder, well, is that truly democratic? In any case, that's what happened. So in Ontario, in 2007, in Ontario in 2007, tied with an election, provincial election, or actually a national election, sorry, there was a referendum, and the committee had recommended using a system called mixed member proportional, which was a combination. It used our current ridings, but fewer of them, and then they had top-up votes. So there was instead of 338 ridings, there were 220 elected the way they are now, but larger ridings. And then the other 118 were basically top-up, depending on the proportion of votes that each party got. And that was what was recommended. Unfortunately, it didn't pass the referendum.
Yeah.
Polls taken afterwards of the voters showed that 50% of the voters in Ontario didn't know what the referendum was about.
Yeah.
They didn't know that what it was being recommended, that it was being recommended on the basis of evidence from all around the world and the Canadian situation. And then 70% of the people in the referendum didn't understand the recommended electoral system, which was mixed member proportional. So, and unfortunately, British Columbia, 58% voted yes, but it had to have 60% in order to pass. Prince Edward Island had a referendum. Again, it didn't make it there either. So
Nothing like having an undemocratic system to determine how your democracy is going to work.
That's right.
Yeah.
And the sad thing is that, why should so many people be so uninformed about what was being proposed? And, back in 2007, in the Ontario referendum, the system that was proposed was called mixed member proportional. It was fairly easy to understand.
Yeah.
It would end up with proportional representation in Parliament.
So it sounds like Fair Vote Canada and Fair Vote Waterloo are the organization to spread that knowledge so that people can no longer claim that they didn't know what was going on. But you've got to reach out to a lot of people that way.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right. And one hopes that the government of the day, the McGuinty government at that time, for the Ontario government, you would hope that the government of the day would explain the whole thing to people.
Yeah.
But it didn't. It did not give much publicity to the whole idea of the referendum or the options that were available.
I remember that the flyers that were handed out by the government to explain the referendum, there weren't enough flyers to go around to every household.
No.
It ended up being organizations like Fair Vote
Yeah.
and like some of the parties who were printing up their own literature
Yeah.
to inform voters on
Yep.
what the referendum issue actually was. And as it turns out, that wasn't particularly effective.
No, and in fact, it can actually work the other way because, let's be honest, different parties have different ideas of what an ideal electoral system
Yeah.
should be.
Yeah.
The truth is that each political party would like to win as many seats as possible. And of course, so we know that there are certain parties who really don't want a proportional system. And there are other parties, particularly smaller parties, who do want a proportional system. So that unfortunately ties into the whole situation.
So our thousands of listeners who have heard you speak on the topic may want to get involved. What's the best way for people to get a hold of Fair Vote?
Well, if you go to Fair Vote, a national website, fairvote.ca, there is lots of information about the whole issue of electoral systems. They have lots of information about every possible electoral system and the advantages of it, and so on and so forth. That's available. And of course, there are 25 chapters across Canada,
Yep.
and Waterloo Region chapter is one of them. And of course, we have a Facebook page, as do many other chapters.
Yep.
So you can easily find out more information that way.
Facebook.com/FairVoteWRC for
Yep.
Waterloo Region chapter.
Yep.
There's a meeting coming up this Thursday at 7:30.
Yes.
It's on Jitsi, meet.jit.si/FairVoteWWR July 10. Bit difficult to remember that. We'll have it on the show notes, but probably
Yes.
well after the meeting is done.
Yes.
You can probably contact Brock Usher, who is the president of Fair Vote Waterloo chapter. You can reach him at brockusher@gmail.com, and I'll be sure he's happy to put you on the mailing list.
Absolutely. And we have many people on our mailing list of people who follow Fair Vote Canada Waterloo Region, and are interested in finding out about various events and so on, and things that are happening.
Check out the Facebook website to find out more.
Yeah.
Dave Arthur, thank you very much for coming in and talking to us about proportional representation, and welcome to the Civic Hub. You've been listening to Welcome to the Civic Hub, where we welcome community partners to the Civic Hub. The Civic Hub is online at civichubwr.org. You can reach the Civic Hub by email at civichub@waterlooregion.org. Welcome to the Civic Hub is produced at the studios of CKMS-FM 102.7 Radio Waterloo. The show is sponsored by the Social Development Centre of Waterloo Region. The executive producer is Alexander Petrovich. Ridika Sharmali is the producer and host. Technical production is by Smaya Farah, and I'm Bob Jonkman. The Civic Hub is supported by the Region of Waterloo Upstream Fund. The theme music is A Good Bass by Kumiku from the Free Music Archive, used under a CC0 license.